Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the absolutely exhausting reality of medieval kingship, where running a kingdom meant juggling assassination, attempts with breakfast meetings, and diplomatic dinners that could literally be your last meal. So, before we get started, hit that like button if you're ready for some historical chaos, and subscribe if you want more stories about people whose job description included. Try not to get murdered by your own family. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see our community spanning the globe. Now grab something comfortable to drink, maybe light a candle for that medieval atmosphere, and settle in as we follow King Edmund, the perpetually exhausted, through a typical day of medieval royal madness. Because trust me, after hearing what these kings dealt with daily, from pig-related legal disputes to marriage negotiations that were basically international treaties with dinner included, you'll never complain about a busy workday again. Let's dive into a world where being king meant being part warrior, part diplomat, part judge, and part target practice for every ambitious noble with a sharp object and a family claim to your throne. Welcome to medieval kingship, where absolute power came with absolutely 0 days off and a disturbingly high probability of being murdered by your own relatives. Meet King Edmund the perpetually exhausted, a composite of every medieval monarch who ever wondered if ruling a kingdom was supposed to involve this much paperwork and so few bathroom breaks. Edmund's day began at dawn, not because he was a morning person, but because medieval alarm clocks were monks chanting lauds at precisely the moment when darkness grudgingly surrendered to light. No snooze button, no coffee, just immediate, unavoidable consciousness, and the crushing weight of divine mandate pressing down on his skull, like a particularly aggressive crown. The king's first act wasn't prayer, despite what the chroniclers would later write. It was listening to his chamberlain rattle off the day's disasters with the enthusiasm of a man reading funeral announcements. Plague in the north, famine in the west, rebellious barons in the east, and something about the French being French again in the south. Each problem required immediate royal attention, because apparently, being anointed by God meant you were personally responsible for everything from crop failures to your subjects' digestive issues. Breakfast was a political event disguised as a meal. Edmund didn't simply eat. He performed the sacred ritual of breaking fast while making decisions that could start wars. The Great Hall buzzed with petitioners, advisors, and hangers, on all desperate for a moment of royal attention. Between bites of bread that had been blessed, inspected, and tasted by someone else for poison, Edmund adjudicated disputes that ranged from the genuinely important to the spectacularly petty. "Your Majesty," announced the seneschal, Lord Reginald claims Sir Geoffrey's pig has been trespassing on his turnip field. This was not a metaphor. This was actual medieval governance. A pig, turnips. Two grown men with swords who couldn't sort this out themselves. Edmund nodded gravely. Because medieval kingship meant treating every pig-based territorial dispute as if it were the Treaty of Westphalia. The morning audience was where Edmund's diplomatic skills were truly tested, not by foreign ambassadors, but by his own nobles who possessed the remarkable ability to turn any conversation into a passive, aggressive threat about feudal obligations. Sir Roderick would arrive with news about bandits on his lands, but what he really meant was, "I need more knights. And by the way, my daughter is marriageable, and I notice your younger brother is still single, wink wink, nudge nudge. Please don't forget my loyalty during the next succession crisis." Medieval kings were basically medieval marriage brokers with armies. Half of Edmund's morning was spent playing matrimonial chess with the bloodlines of Europe. His sister needed a husband who could bring military alliance, but wouldn't murder her for her dowry. His cousin required a wife whose father controlled strategic river crossings, but whose brothers weren't actively plotting treason. Every marriage was a treaty. Every treaty was a potential war. Every war was a potential marriage. It was like a soap opera written by Machiavelli, and performed by people wearing very heavy metal clothing. By mid-morning, Edmund would transition to what medieval chroniclers euphemistically called administrative duties, which was code for trying to extract taxes from people who communicated primarily through armed resistance. Tax collection in the Middle Ages wasn't an administrative process. It was a military campaign with arithmetic involved. The royal treasurer would present ledgers showing who owed what, while the royal marshal explained why half the debtors were currently in rebellion, dead, or claiming sanctuary in churches. The Baron of Greystone owes 300 marks. The treasurer would announce, "The Baron of Greystone is currently besieged in his own castle by his peasants." The marshal would add helpfully, "Excellent," Edmund would reply, because medieval kingship meant finding the silver lining in every peasant uprising. When he surrenders, he'll be much more cooperative about payment. The king's judicial responsibilities were equally complex. Medieval law wasn't a system of statutes and precedents. It was a collection of traditions, customs, and blood feuds that had been accumulating complexity since Charlemagne had a bad day and decided to formalize revenge. Edmund's court heard cases that would make modern legal scholars weep. Property disputes that had been running for 3 generations. Inheritance claims based on dream visions. Criminal cases where the primary evidence was trial by ordeal and the backup plan was trial by combat. The famous case of the disputed Dovercoat illustrates the elegant complexity of medieval jurisprudence. 2 knights claimed ownership of a stone dovecoat based on competing interpretations of a charter written in Latin by a monk who had been drunk at the time. The first knight argued that his grandfather's great uncle had received the dovecoat as payment for military service. The second knight countered that his father's second cousin had inherited it through marriage to a woman whose dowry included all structures housing winged creatures except roosters. Edmund listened to 6 hours of testimony about medieval bird law before declaring that the dovecoat would belong to whichever knight it, and presented the capture of the whichever was under the fattest dog by sunset. This was considered both wise and legally binding. Medieval justice was basically elaborate problem, solving with swords as the ultimate appeals court. The afternoon brought military planning, which in the Middle Ages meant staring at maps and trying to figure out which of your allies were about to become your enemies. Edmund's war council consisted of men who had spent their entire lives perfecting the art of killing other men in increasingly creative ways while wearing enough metal to build a small church. They discussed siege tactics with the passion of wine enthusiasts, debated the merits of various crossbow designs like art critics, and planned campaigns with the detailed precision of wedding coordinators. Medieval warfare was simultaneously brutally simple and bewilderingly complex. The simple part was that most conflicts boiled down to ride over there and hit them with swords until they stopped disagreeing with us. The complex part was that over there might be controlled by a brother, in-law's cousin's feudal overlord, who owed military service to your ally's enemy, who was married to your sister's former betrothed, who had a competing claim to your throne based on a papal decree that may or may not have been forged. Every military campaign required diplomatic negotiations more intricate than a peace treaty. Edmund couldn't simply declare war. He had to carefully manage the feudal obligations that bound his kingdom together, like a particularly unstable house of cards. Sir William owed 40 days of military service, but only if the campaign was within 100 miles of his lands and didn't conflict with harvest season. Lord Robert would provide 50 knights, but expected his son to be knighted in return, his daughter to be married advantageously, and his castle to be expanded at royal expense. The Duke of somewhere important would join the campaign enthusiastically, provided Edmund agreed to support his claim to some other duchy that was currently occupied by people who disagreed about their ownership status. Medieval logistics would have given modern supply officers nervous breakdowns. Moving an army meant feeding thousands of men and horses While traveling through territories where the local population viewed armed strangers with the same enthusiasm, they reserved for tax collectors and plague-bearing rats. Every village along the march route had to be negotiated with, bribed, or conquered, depending on their level of cooperation and their available food supplies. The army will require 1,200 loaves of bread per day. Edmund's quartermaster would announce, "The region produces approximately 400 loaves per day." The scout would reply, "Then we'll need to negotiate with 3 adjacent regions, or modify our definition of bread to include anything that doesn't fight back when bitten." Edmund would conclude, because medieval campaign planning required both diplomatic flexibility and dietary creativity. The late afternoon was reserved for what medieval chroniclers called receiving foreign delegations, which sounds dignified until you realize that medieval diplomacy was performed by men who considered poisoning their host's wine a legitimate negotiating tactic. Foreign ambassadors arrived at Edmund's court with gifts that were simultaneously bribes, threats, and intelligence, gathering operations disguised as cultural exchange. The Byzantine ambassador brought silk that was probably gorgeous and definitely bugged with hidden messages. The Venetian merchant, diplomat offered trade agreements that would make Edmund wealthy and subordinate to Venetian commercial interests. The French envoy presented a treaty of friendship that was basically a declaration of war written in very polite language, while the Holy Roman Emperor's representative delivered an invitation to a coronation that was actually a summons to bend the knee disguised as a social event. Edmund received each delegation with the appropriate ceremony, which meant sitting very still while wearing an extremely heavy crown and trying to decode diplomatic language that made legal documents look like children's books. When the French ambassador declared that his king desired perpetual amity and mutual respect for territorial sovereignty, Edmund understood this as, "We're planning to invade you, but we're hoping you'll be too distracted by our fancy words to notice our army massing at the border." Medieval diplomatic gifts were exercises in passive, aggressive international relations. International relations. A sword meant either, "We respect your martial prowess," or, "We know you're going to need this soon." Exotic animals were tokens of friendship that would bankrupt the recipient through feeding costs. Religious relics were pious offerings that happened to come with claims of supernatural protection that definitely wouldn't work against the gifting party's specific military tactics. The most challenging diplomatic dance involved the church, which in the Middle Ages meant navigating a relationship with people who claimed to speak for God while behaving like particularly ambitious politicians. The local bishop would arrive regularly to discuss spiritual matters, which was medieval code for reminding you that I have the power to declare your marriage invalid and your crown illegitimate if you don't do what I want. Medieval kings were caught between earthly and heavenly authority in ways that would make constitutional lawyers weep. The church provided legitimacy, educated administrators, and moral authority, but it also demanded obedience, financial support, and occasionally the right to dictate foreign policy based on theological considerations. Edmund might want to invade the neighboring kingdom for perfectly sensible reasons like natural resources or strategic positioning, but the bishop would explain that God disapproved because the target kingdom had recently built a particularly impressive cathedral. The Pope, meanwhile, operated from Rome like a medieval supranational authority with the power to excommunicate kings, invalidate treaties, and declare crusades that would drain royal treasuries for generations. Papal politics were Byzantine in their complexity, literally in some cases. As successive popes maneuvered between the Holy Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and various Italian city-states while claiming to represent universal Christian authority, Edmund's relationship with Rome involved correspondence that read like diplomatic negotiations between alien civilizations. The Pope would write demanding financial support for a crusade against people Edmund had never heard of in places he couldn't locate on a map. while simultaneously explaining that Edmund's proposed marriage alliance violated canonical law in ways that could only be resolved through substantial monetary donations to specific papal charities. The evening meal was when medieval kingship transformed from political performance into elaborate social theatre. The great hall filled with nobles, clergy, merchants, and entertainers, all carefully arranged according to a seating protocol that would make modern event planners have panic attacks. Where you sat determined your social status, your political influence, and your access to the good wine. Placing someone too close to the royal table implied favoritism that could start a civil war. Seating them too far away suggested royal displeasure that could end a political career. Medieval table service was a military operation performed with utensils. Each course required its own ceremony, its own serving ritual, and its own opportunities for poisoning, which meant that every meal was a carefully orchestrated dance of food tasters, wine checkers, and servants whose primary qualification was their willingness to die for their employer's dinner safety. The entertainment during royal meals reflected the medieval appreciation for violence as performance art. Minstrels sang songs about heroes who solved their problems through creative applications of warfare. Jesters told jokes that were basically political commentary disguised as humor, allowing them to mock the powerful while maintaining plausible deniability about their treasonous implications. Acrobats performed feats of strength and agility that demonstrated human potential, while reminding everyone that bodies were fragile things that could be broken in spectacular ways. Dancing at medieval courts was a competitive sport disguised as social activity. The steps were complex enough to demonstrate education and refinement, but the real challenge was navigating the political implications of dance partnership choices. Dancing with the wrong person's wife could start a blood feud. Declining to dance with someone could be interpreted as a diplomatic insult. Performing the steps incorrectly was a social disaster that could affect political standing for generations. The most fascinating aspect of medieval royal entertainment was the storytelling tradition, which served as news media, political commentary, and propaganda delivery system all rolled into one. Traveling storytellers brought tales from distant lands that were part adventure story, part intelligence briefing, and part cultural exchange program. A story about a brave knight defeating a dragon was actually a coded report about military developments in neighboring kingdoms, with the dragon representing whatever political threat the audience was supposed to worry about. After the evening meal came what medieval chroniclers politely termed private royal business, which covered everything from secret diplomatic negotiations to family drama that would make reality television look sophisticated. Medieval royal families were basically crime syndicates with divine sanction, and the evening hours were when the real business happened. Edmund's private chambers hosted meetings that would determine the fate of kingdoms. Spies reported intelligence gathered from enemy courts, often delivered in codes so complex that deciphering them required teams of educated clerks working through the night. Military commanders presented battle plans that had been months in preparation, detailing strategies that accounted for everything from weather patterns to the personal grudges of individual knights. The most sensitive discussions involved succession planning, which in the Middle Ages meant preparing for the inevitable moment when someone would try to murder you for your crown. Medieval kings lived with the constant awareness that their reign was a temporary arrangement that could end violently at any moment. Every decision about marriage, alliances, and inheritance was made with the understanding that political enemies were constantly looking for opportunities to claim royal authority through force. Royal marriage negotiations were conducted like military campaigns, with intelligence gathering operations to assess potential spouses, political connections, financial resources, and likelihood of producing male heirs. Medieval royal marriages weren't romantic partnerships. They were political mergers conducted by people who might never meet their prospective spouse until the wedding ceremony. A king choosing a queen was essentially selecting a business partner whose family came with armies, treasuries, and claims to additional territory. The diplomatic correspondence alone required teams of educated scribes working in multiple languages. A marriage proposal to a foreign princess involved negotiations with her father, her feudal overlords, her country's religious authorities, and potentially the Pope, depending on how the canonical law intersected with their respective family trees. Each letter had to be crafted carefully to convey the right level of respect, interest, and political leverage without accidentally declaring war or implying divine claims that could be interpreted as heretical. Medieval royal children were political assets from birth, their futures planned before they could walk. Sons were destined for military training, political marriages and territorial inheritance, while daughters were groomed for strategic marriages that would secure alliances and expand family influence. Royal nurseries were basically diplomatic training centers where children learned that their personal preferences were subordinate to dynastic necessity. The night hours also brought the most dangerous aspect of medieval kingship, the constant threat of assassination. Medieval kings slept lightly, surrounded by guards whose loyalty had been purchased, tested, and retested through elaborate systems of rewards and threats. Every meal, every drink, every social interaction carried the possibility of poison, stabbing, or some other form of creative regicide. Royal bedchambers were fortresses within fortresses, designed to protect sleeping kings from the remarkably diverse ways medieval people had developed for killing their political leaders. Secret passages allowed for emergency escape routes, while hidden guards monitored approaches to the royal quarters. Even sleep was a political act, performed under conditions of constant vigilance that would exhaust modern security professionals. The most sophisticated assassination attempts involved long-term planning that could span years. Enemy agents would infiltrate royal households as servants, gradually working their way into positions of trust while gathering intelligence and waiting for optimal opportunities to strike. Medieval counterintelligence involved elaborate systems of surveillance, double agents, and loyalty tests that made court life resemble a deadly chess game where every move could be the last. Medieval kings also had to manage what modern leaders would recognize as public relations, though the medieval version involved more public executions and fewer press conferences. Royal public appearances were carefully orchestrated performances designed to demonstrate divine authority, political power, and military strength. Every royal progress through the kingdom was a combination of political rally, military parade, and religious ceremony designed to remind subjects that their king ruled by God's will and possessed the power to enforce that authority. Public ceremonies required massive logistical coordination. Royal coronations involved assembling nobles from across the kingdom, organizing religious ceremonies that satisfied both local and papal requirements, and staging celebrations that demonstrated royal wealth and generosity. Tournament competitions showcased royal military power while providing entertainment that kept potentially rebellious nobles occupied with hitting each other instead of plotting treason. The royal treasury was both the source of royal power and its greatest vulnerability. Medieval kings were constantly balancing the need to demonstrate wealth against the necessity of maintaining financial resources for military campaigns, diplomatic negotiations, and the elaborate court expenses that maintained their political position. Royal accounting was performed by educated clerks who tracked expenditures ranging from military equipment purchases to the costs of feeding exotic animals received as diplomatic gifts. Medieval taxation was an art form that required equal parts legal knowledge, military threats, and psychological manipulation. Kings couldn't simply demand money from their subjects. They had to justify tax collection through elaborate legal frameworks that referenced feudal obligations, divine authority, and precedents that had been established through centuries of tradition and warfare. Each tax assessment involved negotiations with local nobles, religious authorities, and merchant guilds, all of whom possessed the political and military power to resist royal demands. The most lucrative royal revenue sources often came from what modern economists would recognize as regulatory capitalism. Kings granted trading privileges, chartered new towns, and licensed market activities in exchange for substantial fees that provided steady income streams. Royal monopolies on salt production, mining rights, and luxury goods imports generated wealth, while allowing kings to control economic activities that might otherwise support rival political authorities. Justice administration provided another significant revenue source through what medieval legal scholars euphemistically called judicial fees. Court proceedings required payments for royal judgment, while criminal penalties often involved financial compensation rather than imprisonment. Medieval kings essentially operated legal systems that functioned as both justice delivery mechanisms and profit-generating enterprises. The most interesting aspect of medieval royal financial management was the credit system that allowed kings to borrow against future revenues. Medieval banking was performed by religious institutions, merchant guilds, and individual financiers who were willing to lend money to royal borrowers in exchange for repayment terms that might include territorial concessions, trading privileges, or marriage alliance agreements. Royal debt was often inherited across generations, creating financial obligations that affected political decision-making for centuries. Medieval kings also managed what modern leaders would recognize as intelligence operations, though the medieval version relied more on human networks and less on technological surveillance. Royal spies operated throughout European courts, gathering information about military preparations, political alliances, and succession planning that could affect their employers' strategic interests. Medieval espionage involved elaborate systems of coded communication, double agents, and disinformation campaigns designed to mislead enemy intelligence operations. The most sophisticated intelligence networks were operated by religious institutions, which possessed international connections that transcended political boundaries. Monastery networks facilitated communication across vast distances, while pilgrim routes provided cover for intelligence agents traveling between kingdoms. Medieval spies often disguised themselves as merchants, scholars, or religious travelers, roles that allowed them to move freely while gathering information about political and military developments. Counter-intelligence operations required constant vigilance against enemy agents who might infiltrate royal households, noble courts, or military organizations. Medieval kings employed elaborate systems of loyalty testing, surveillance, and information compartmentalization designed to prevent enemy intelligence operations while maintaining the secrecy of their own strategic planning. Court life resembled a constant chess game, where every social interaction carried potential intelligence implications. Medieval royal education was a lifelong process that combined practical leadership training with the theoretical knowledge required for effective governance. Kings studied military strategy, legal precedents, diplomatic protocols, and financial management while simultaneously learning to navigate the complex social hierarchies that determined political power. Royal tutors were often the most educated individuals in the kingdom, responsible for preparing future kings to manage responsibilities that would determine the fate of thousands of their subjects. The intellectual demands of medieval kingship were often underestimated by modern observers, who focus on the military and ceremonial aspects of royal authority. Medieval kings needed to understand complex legal systems, master multiple languages for diplomatic communication, and develop sophisticated understanding of economic principles that governed trade, taxation, and financial planning. Royal libraries contained works on theology, philosophy, military science, and administrative techniques that provided the theoretical foundation for practical governance decisions. Medieval kings also served as cultural patrons whose support determined the development of art, architecture, literature, and scholarship throughout their kingdoms. Royal patronage funded cathedral construction, manuscript illumination, musical composition, and literary works that reflected and reinforced royal political authority. Medieval culture was essentially royal propaganda, expressed through artistic achievement that demonstrated both royal wealth and divine favor. The architectural legacy of medieval kingship reflects the dual nature of royal authority as both earthly and spiritual power. Royal castles were fortified residences designed for military defense, administrative efficiency, and ceremonial display of royal magnificence. Cathedral construction projects demonstrated royal piety, while providing employment for skilled craftsmen, whose loyalty could be secured through steady wages, funded by royal treasuries. Medieval royal courts were also centers of technological innovation, where practical problems of governance drove developments in record keeping, communication, transportation, and military equipment. Royal administrators developed accounting techniques, legal documentation systems, and bureaucratic procedures that influenced governmental efficiency throughout Europe. Military competition between rival kingdoms accelerated weapons development, fortification design, and siege warfare techniques that represented the cutting edge of medieval technology. The daily routine of medieval kingship concluded with evening prayers that served both religious and political functions. Medieval kings were expected to demonstrate piety through regular devotional practices, but royal prayers also provided opportunities for private reflection on the day's political developments and strategic planning for future challenges. Medieval royal spirituality was inseparable from political authority, as kings claimed divine sanction for their earthly power, while accepting religious obligations that limited their freedom of action. The night watch that protected sleeping kings also represented the broader challenges of medieval royal authority. Medieval kings ruled through personal relationships, military force, and divine legitimacy, but their power was constantly challenged by rivals who possessed alternative claims to political authority. Royal security was ultimately dependent on the loyalty of subjects, whose support could shift based on changing political circumstances, military success, or religious developments that affected royal legitimacy. Medieval kingship was perhaps the world's most demanding job description: military commander, chief justice, diplomatic negotiator, financial administrator, cultural patron, religious leader, and family patriarch. All while wearing a crown that weighed several pounds and constantly reminded everyone that your authority came with target painted on your back. The daily life of a medieval king involved managing responsibilities that would challenge modern government bureaucracies, while operating with resources and information systems that would seem primitive by contemporary standards. The remarkable aspect of medieval royal authority was how effectively kings managed to maintain political control over vast territories and diverse populations using personal relationships, symbolic authority, and military force as their primary governmental tools. Medieval kings couldn't rely on modern communication technologies, transportation infrastructure, or administrative bureaucracies, yet they succeeded in creating political stability that lasted for generations and cultural achievements that continue to influence contemporary civilization. The legacy of medieval kingship demonstrates both the possibilities and limitations of personal political authority. Medieval kings achieved remarkable success in unifying territories, defending against external threats, and promoting cultural development, but their authority was ultimately dependent on individual charisma, military success, and divine legitimacy that could be challenged by rivals who possessed alternative sources of political power. Every medieval king went to sleep knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges to royal authority, fresh threats to political stability, and additional opportunities to demonstrate the divine favor that legitimized earthly power. Medieval kingship was essentially a daily performance of political theatre, conducted under conditions of constant danger, with stakes that included not only personal survival, but the fate of entire kingdoms and the subjects who depended on royal protection for their security and prosperity. The seasonal variations in royal duties added another layer of complexity to medieval kingship. Summer meant campaign season, when kings were expected to personally lead military expeditions that could last for months. Medieval armies couldn't fight effectively in winter, partly due to weather conditions, but mostly because medieval logistics broke down when supply lines froze and horses died of cold. This meant that every summer was potentially Edmund's last, as military campaigns involved personal combat, where royal armor provided protection against arrows, but offered limited defense against political miscalculation. Spring brought planting season, which required royal attention to agricultural policies that determined whether the kingdom would eat or starve during the following winter. Medieval kings were essentially agricultural administrators whose decisions about crop allocation, seed distribution, and farming techniques directly affected the survival of their subjects. Royal agricultural policy wasn't theoretical economic planning. It was life and death decision making based on weather predictions that relied on folk wisdom and prayer. Autumn meant harvest time and tax collection. When kings discovered whether their agricultural policies had succeeded and their subjects possessed the resources necessary to fund royal government. Medieval tax collection was performed through a combination of negotiation, intimidation, and creative accounting that would make modern revenue services seem gentle by comparison. Royal tax collectors were essentially armed bureaucrats whose job description included both mathematical computation and combat readiness. Winter provided the closest thing to a break that medieval kings experienced, though break meant fewer opportunities for outdoor warfare rather than actual rest. Winter months were devoted to indoor political activities, planning next year's campaigns, negotiating marriage alliances, and managing the court politics that determined royal survival through the dark months, when food was scarce and tempers were short. The religious calendar imposed additional demands on royal schedules. Medieval Christianity wasn't a Sunday, only obligation. It was a comprehensive lifestyle that required royal participation in numerous holy days, feast celebrations, and spiritual observances throughout the year. Each religious holiday demanded royal attendance at ceremonial masses, charitable distributions to demonstrate royal piety, and political receptions that combined spiritual devotion with diplomatic opportunity. Easter required elaborate celebrations that demonstrated royal commitment to Christian faith, while providing opportunities for political reconciliation with rival nobles. Christmas involved gift exchanges that were essentially diplomatic negotiations, disguised as religious celebration, where the value and appropriateness of royal gifts conveyed subtle political messages about relationships and expectations. Medieval royal gift giving was a complex art form where every present carried multiple layers of meaning that recipients needed to decode carefully to avoid misunderstanding royal intentions. The most challenging religious observances involved pilgrimages, which medieval kings undertook both for spiritual reasons and as elaborate diplomatic missions. Royal pilgrimages required massive logistical coordination, involving hundreds of retainers, military escorts, and diplomatic arrangements with every territory along the pilgrimage route. A royal pilgrimage to Jerusalem wasn't just a spiritual journey, it was a military expedition that could take years to complete and cost fortunes to fund. Medieval kings also managed what modern leaders would recognize as public health crises. Though medieval medicine was based more on prayer and bloodletting than scientific understanding, plague outbreaks required royal responses that combined quarantine measures, religious ceremonies, and economic policies designed to maintain political stability during health emergencies. Medieval public health policy was essentially disaster management performed by people whose understanding of disease transmission was limited, but whose practical experience with crisis response was extensive. The Black Death, which periodically swept through medieval Europe, presented kings with challenges that tested every aspect of royal authority. Economic disruption caused by massive population loss required policy adjustments that affected taxation, labor relations, and social hierarchies throughout the kingdom. Religious crisis caused by apparent divine displeasure demanded royal responses that demonstrated both piety and practical leadership. Political instability created by social upheaval provided opportunities for rival claimants to challenge royal authority when kings were most vulnerable. Medieval royal households were essentially small cities that travelled with the king, requiring constant logistical management that would challenge modern event planners. Royal progresses through the kingdom involved moving hundreds of people, including nobles, servants, guards, entertainers, and administrative staff, along with their horses, equipment, supplies, and personal belongings. Medieval kings didn't have permanent capital cities. They ruled through constant movement that brought royal authority directly to their subjects. The economic impact of royal visits was substantial. A royal household could consume a region's entire food production within days, requiring advanced planning and resource coordination that affected local communities for months before and after royal arrivals. Medieval hospitality was both an honor and a financial burden that could bankrupt noble hosts who were expected to provide accommodations worthy of royal dignity, while competing with rivals for royal favor. Royal traveling arrangements required military precision and diplomatic sensitivity. Route planning involved negotiations with local authorities, assessment of political conditions, and security arrangements that protected royal safety, while demonstrating royal power. Medieval kings traveled with armed escorts that were large enough to deter bandits, but small enough to avoid appearing as invading armies to nervous local populations. The cultural impact of royal visits extended far beyond their immediate political purposes. Royal courts brought together the most talented artists, musicians, scholars, and craftsmen in the kingdom, creating temporary centers of cultural activity that influenced local artistic development for generations. Medieval royal patronage wasn't just financial support, it was active participation in cultural creation that shaped the artistic legacy of entire civilizations. Medieval kings were also responsible for legal innovation that adapted traditional customs to changing social conditions. Royal courts served as laboratories for legal experimentation, where new precedents were established through practical problem solving. Medieval legal development was essentially case law creation performed by people whose primary qualification was political authority rather than legal training. Yet their decisions created legal frameworks that influenced European jurisprudence for centuries. The most complex legal challenges involved conflicts between different legal traditions that operated simultaneously within medieval kingdoms. Roman law, Germanic custom, canonical law, and local traditions all claimed authority over different aspects of medieval life, creating legal conflicts that required royal arbitration. Medieval kings essentially served as Supreme Court justices whose decisions reconciled competing legal systems through practical compromise rather than theoretical consistency. Commercial law represented a particularly challenging area of royal legal responsibility. Medieval trade involved transactions between merchants who operated under different legal systems, used different currencies, and followed different commercial customs. Royal commercial law was developed through pragmatic solutions to practical problems rather than systematic legal theory, creating commercial frameworks that facilitated international trade, despite the absence of standardized legal codes. Maritime law presented unique challenges for medieval kings whose territories included coastal regions. Medieval naval warfare, merchant shipping, and fishing rights all required legal frameworks that addressed jurisdictional questions about authority over water-based activities. Royal maritime law was essentially international law creation performed by kings who claimed sovereignty over waters that other kings also considered their territorial responsibility. The intellectual challenges of medieval kingship extended beyond practical governance to include philosophical questions about the nature of political authority, divine mandate, and social responsibility. Medieval political theory was developed through practical experimentation rather than abstract speculation, as kings struggled to balance competing claims about the source and limits of royal power. Medieval kings were essentially political philosophers whose theories were tested through practical application in circumstances where theoretical mistakes had immediate, often fatal, consequences. The most sophisticated medieval political thinking involved questions about the relationship between earthly and spiritual authority. Medieval kings claimed divine sanction for their political power while acknowledging religious limitations on their freedom of action. This created complex theological, political questions about the extent of royal authority, the limits of religious influence, and the proper relationship between church and state that influenced European political development for centuries. Medieval royal education reflected the intellectual demands of kingship through curricula that combined practical skills with theoretical knowledge. Royal tutors were responsible for preparing future kings to understand legal principles, military strategy, diplomatic protocols, economic theory, and theological concepts that provided the intellectual foundation for effective governance. Medieval royal education was essentially leadership training performed by the most educated individuals available, using educational methods that combined academic instruction with practical experience. The linguistic demands of medieval kingship required royal fluency in multiple languages that facilitated diplomatic communication, legal administration, and cultural patronage. Medieval kings needed to communicate effectively with subjects who spoke different languages, negotiate with foreign diplomats whose native tongues varied across Europe, and understand legal documents written in Latin, the universal language of medieval legal and administrative communication. Medieval royal libraries represented some of the largest collections of written knowledge available in their respective kingdoms. Royal book collections included works on law, theology, philosophy, military science, medicine, and literature that provided intellectual resources for royal decision-making. Medieval books were extremely valuable, as each copy was hand-produced by skilled scribes whose work required months or years to complete. Royal libraries were essentially treasure houses of intellectual capital that represented massive investments in educational infrastructure. The administrative demands of medieval kingship created some of the earliest examples of systematic record keeping and bureaucratic organization in European history. Royal chancelleries developed standardized procedures for document production, record storage, and administrative communication that influenced governmental efficiency throughout medieval Europe. Medieval royal administration was essentially the foundation of modern bureaucratic government, developed through practical necessity by kings who needed efficient systems for managing complex political responsibilities. Medieval kings also pioneered early forms of intelligence analysis that combined information gathering with strategic assessment. Royal councils included advisors whose primary responsibility was analyzing political, military, and economic intelligence to support royal decision-making. Medieval intelligence analysis was performed by scholars and diplomats who possessed the linguistic skills, cultural knowledge, and analytical abilities necessary to interpret information gathered from diverse sources across Europe and beyond. The technological innovations sponsored by medieval royal courts included developments in military equipment, architectural techniques, transportation methods, and communication systems that represented the cutting edge of medieval technology. Royal patronage of technological innovation wasn't driven by scientific curiosity, but by practical needs for military advantage, administrative efficiency, and economic development that enhanced royal power and territorial security. Medieval royal courts also served as centers for medical innovation, where royal physicians developed treatments and surgical techniques that represented the most advanced medical knowledge available. royal medical care wasn't just personal health maintenance, it was investment in political stability, as royal health directly affected succession planning, military leadership, and diplomatic negotiations. Medieval royal physicians were essentially the equivalent of modern heads of state medical teams, whose responsibility extended beyond individual patient care to include political risk assessment related to royal health conditions. The environmental challenges faced by medieval kings included managing natural disasters, climate variations, and resource depletion that affected agricultural production, economic stability, and political security. Medieval environmental policy was developed through practical responses to immediate crises rather than systematic environmental planning, yet royal decisions about forest management, water rights, and mining activities had long-term environmental consequences that affected kingdoms for generations. Medieval kings were essentially environmental managers whose decisions about natural resource utilization determined the long-term sustainability of their kingdoms. Forest management policies affected timber availability for construction, fuel supplies for heating and cooking, and hunting resources that provided both food and royal entertainment. Medieval royal forest law was among the most detailed and strictly enforced legal codes, reflecting the economic and political importance of forest resources in medieval society. Water rights management represented another critical aspect of medieval royal environmental responsibility. Control over rivers, streams, and water sources affected transportation, agricultural irrigation, industrial production, and urban water supplies that determined the economic and political viability of medieval settlements. Medieval kings exercised authority over water resources through legal frameworks that balanced competing claims while maintaining royal control over strategically important waterways. Mining rights provided both revenue sources and environmental challenges for medieval kings. Royal control over mineral extraction created income streams through taxation and direct exploitation, while requiring environmental policies that managed the long-term consequences of mining activities. Medieval mining law was developed through practical responses to immediate problems rather than systematic environmental planning. Yet royal mining policies had environmental effects that continued for centuries. The psychological demands of medieval kingship created mental health challenges that would challenge modern psychiatrists. Medieval kings lived under constant stress that combined the pressure of life and death decision-making with the isolation imposed by absolute authority. Royal paranoia wasn't a personality disorder, it was a survival strategy necessary for detecting assassination plots, political conspiracies, and family betrayals that could end royal reigns at any moment. Medieval kings developed what modern psychologists would recognize as hypervigilance, a state of constant alertness that allowed rapid response to threats, but created exhaustion that affected judgment and decision-making ability. The loneliness of medieval royal authority was profound and inescapable. Kings couldn't trust their advisors completely, as political advancement often required betraying previous loyalties. Royal friendships were complicated by the power differential that made genuine equality impossible. Even royal marriages were primarily political arrangements, where emotional intimacy competed with dynastic obligations and succession planning. Medieval kings were surrounded by people who needed their favor, wanted their power, or planned their destruction, creating social isolation that would challenge even the most psychologically resilient individuals. Sleep disorders were common among medieval kings, whose responsibilities included making decisions that affected thousands of lives while managing constant threats to personal survival. Royal insomnia wasn't just inconvenience, it was occupational hazard that affected cognitive function, emotional regulation, and physical health in ways that influenced political stability throughout the kingdom. Medieval kings who couldn't sleep effectively became ineffective rulers, whose poor judgment created political crises that threatened dynastic survival. The eating habits of medieval kings reflected both the ceremonial demands of royal authority and the practical challenges of avoiding poisoning. Royal meals were public performances where food choices conveyed political messages about royal wealth, cultural sophistication, and diplomatic relationships. Exotic foods demonstrated international connections and economic resources, while traditional dishes showed connection to local customs and agricultural production. Medieval royal dining was essentially edible diplomacy performed under conditions where every bite could be potentially fatal. Royal food tasting was a complex security operation that involved multiple layers of protection against poisoning attempts. Food tasters were selected for their loyalty, trained to detect suspicious flavors or textures, and compensated for accepting mortal risk as part of their employment. Medieval royal kitchens operated under security protocols that would impress modern intelligence agencies, with controlled access, supervised preparation, and documented chain of custody for all ingredients used in royal meals. The wardrobe of medieval kings represented massive economic investments that demonstrated royal wealth while serving practical functions in diplomatic and military contexts. Royal clothing was essentially wearable propaganda that conveyed messages about political authority, cultural sophistication, and economic resources. Medieval royal garments were produced by skilled craftsmen using expensive materials imported from distant regions, creating clothing that represented the economic output of entire villages and demonstrated royal control over international trade networks. Medieval royal jewelry served functions beyond personal decoration, representing portable wealth that could finance military campaigns, diplomatic negotiations, or emergency escapes during political crises. Royal crowns, rings, and ceremonial weapons were both symbols of authority and financial assets, whose value provided economic security during uncertain times. Medieval kings wore their treasuries as personal accessories, creating impressive visual displays that demonstrated royal resources while keeping wealth accessible for immediate use. The personal hygiene practices of medieval kings reflected both the limited understanding of sanitation available during the period and the ceremonial requirements of royal authority. Royal bathing was infrequent by modern standards, but elaborate when it occurred, involving heated water, imported soaps, and attendants who managed the complex logistics of providing clean conditions for royal personal care. Medieval royal hygiene was influenced more by contemporary medical theory than practical understanding of disease prevention, creating bathing rituals that were ceremonially impressive but medically questionable. Medieval royal medical care represented the most advanced healthcare available during the period. Though modern medical professionals would consider medieval treatments dangerous rather than beneficial, royal physicians were educated scholars who understood contemporary medical theory, possessed access to exotic medications, and developed surgical techniques through practical experience treating royal patients. Medieval royal medicine combined theoretical knowledge with practical experimentation, creating medical traditions that influenced healthcare development while reflecting the limited scientific understanding available during the period. The dental health of medieval kings was generally poor by modern standards, reflecting both dietary factors and limited dental care techniques available during the period. Royal diets included substantial amounts of sugar from imported luxuries, while medieval dental care relied on primitive extraction techniques and herbal remedies that provided limited relief from dental problems. Medieval royal dental issues affected more than personal comfort. They influenced political presentation, military leadership, and diplomatic effectiveness in ways that could affect political stability throughout the kingdom. Medieval royal personal relationships were complicated by the political implications of every social interaction. Royal friendships required careful navigation of competing loyalties, political obligations, and succession implications that could transform personal relationships into political liabilities. Medieval kings developed social skills that balanced authentic human connection with political necessity, creating relationship patterns that would seem coldly calculating to modern observers, but represented survival strategies necessary for maintaining political authority. The entertainment preferences of medieval kings reflected both personal interests and political requirements for demonstrating royal cultural sophistication. Royal patronage of musicians, storytellers, and performers wasn't just personal enjoyment, it was cultural investment that demonstrated royal wealth, attracted talented artists to royal service, and created entertainment that reinforced royal political messages. Medieval royal entertainment was essentially propaganda performed by artists whose creativity served political purposes while providing personal enjoyment for royal audiences. Medieval royal gaming and gambling represented both recreational activities and diplomatic tools for building relationships with nobles, foreign dignitaries, and potential allies. Royal gaming involved substantial financial stakes that demonstrated royal wealth while creating opportunities for political negotiation disguised as social interaction. Medieval kings used games of chance and skill as informal diplomatic venues where political relationships could be developed through shared recreational activities that reduced formal protocol barriers. The sporting activities of medieval kings combined physical exercise with military training and political demonstration. Royal hunting was both recreational activity and practical preparation for warfare, while tournament participation allowed kings to demonstrate martial skills, while building relationships with noble knights whose loyalty was essential for political survival. Medieval royal sports were essentially military exercises performed for entertainment value, creating spectacular displays that demonstrated royal physical capability while maintaining combat readiness. Medieval royal travel arrangements required logistical coordination that would challenge modern event planners. Royal progress through the kingdom involved moving entire households that included nobles, servants, guards, entertainers, and administrative staff, along with their horses, equipment, and supplies. Medieval royal travel was essentially mobile city management, requiring advanced planning, resource coordination, and security arrangements that affected every region visited by royal entourages. The economic impact of royal visits on local communities was substantial and long-lasting. Royal households could consume regional food production within days, requiring advanced resource accumulation that affected local agriculture and commerce for months before royal arrivals. Medieval royal hospitality obligations could financially devastate noble hosts who were expected to provide accommodations worthy of royal dignity, while competing for royal favor through displays of wealth and generosity. Medieval royal communication systems represented some of the most sophisticated information networks available during the period. Royal messengers operated across vast distances using relay systems that facilitated communication between royal courts and distant administrative centers. Medieval royal mail service was essentially early postal systems that enabled governance over territories too large for direct personal oversight, creating communication capabilities that influenced political integration and administrative efficiency throughout European kingdoms. The linguistic challenges of medieval royal administration required communication systems that accommodated multiple languages spoken throughout diverse kingdoms. Royal chancelleries employed scribes fluent in Latin, vernacular languages, and foreign tongues necessary for diplomatic correspondence. Medieval royal linguistic policies influenced cultural development by determining which languages were used for official documents, legal proceedings, and administrative communication throughout royal territories. Medieval royal record keeping systems created some of the earliest examples of systematic documentation in European history. Royal archives contained legal documents, diplomatic correspondence, financial records, and administrative reports that provided institutional memory essential for effective governance. Medieval royal documentation represented massive investments in information management that created governmental capabilities far more sophisticated than modern observers typically associate with medieval administration. The artistic patronage of medieval kings influenced cultural development throughout Europe by supporting artistic innovation and cultural exchange. Royal commissions funded architectural projects, manuscript illumination, musical composition, and literary works that represented the artistic peak of medieval civilization. Medieval royal cultural investment wasn't just aesthetic preference. It was political strategy that demonstrated royal sophistication, attracted talented artists to royal service, and created cultural products that reinforced royal authority through artistic excellence. Medieval royal architectural projects represented both practical governance needs and symbolic demonstrations of royal power. Royal castles combined military fortification with administrative functionality and ceremonial space designed to impress visitors with royal magnificence. Cathedral construction sponsored by royal patronage created spiritual centers that demonstrated royal piety while providing architectural monuments that influenced regional development for centuries. The technological innovation sponsored by medieval royal courts included developments in military engineering, architectural techniques, and manufacturing processes that represented cutting-edge medieval technology. Royal investment in technological development was driven by practical needs for military advantage, administrative efficiency, and economic productivity that enhanced royal power while contributing to broader technological progress throughout medieval Europe. Medieval royal libraries represented some of the largest collections of written knowledge available during the period. Royal book collections included works on law, theology, philosophy, military science, medicine, and literature that provided intellectual resources for royal decision-making. Medieval books were extremely valuable, as each copy required months or years of hand production by skilled scribes. Royal libraries were essentially treasure houses of intellectual capital that represented massive investments in educational infrastructure. The educational systems developed around medieval royal courts created some of the earliest examples of systematic higher education in European history. Royal schools trained administrative personnel, diplomatic staff, and military leaders whose education provided the intellectual foundation for effective governance. Medieval royal education represented investment in human capital that created governmental capabilities, essential for managing complex political responsibilities across vast territories. Medieval royal judicial systems created legal frameworks that influenced European jurisprudence for centuries. Royal courts developed legal precedents through practical problem-solving that adapted traditional customs to changing social conditions. Medieval royal legal innovation was performed by politically motivated decision-makers rather than legal theorists. Yet their practical solutions created legal principles that provided foundations for modern European legal systems. The international diplomatic networks, developed by medieval royal courts, created some of the earliest examples of systematic international relations in European history. Royal diplomatic correspondence facilitated communication between kingdoms that enabled conflict resolution, alliance formation, and cultural exchange across vast distances. Medieval royal diplomacy represented sophisticated international relationship management that created political stability and cultural interaction throughout medieval Europe. Medieval royal military organizations represented some of the most advanced military systems available during the period. Royal armies combined traditional feudal obligations with innovative tactical developments and logistical capabilities that enabled military campaigns across vast distances. Medieval royal military innovation was driven by competitive pressures that accelerated weapons development, tactical evolution, and organizational improvement throughout European military establishments. The economic policies developed by medieval royal governments created some of the earliest examples of systematic economic management in European history. Royal taxation systems, trade regulations, and monetary policies represented sophisticated economic intervention that influenced commercial development throughout royal territories. Medieval royal economic management was performed by politically motivated administrators rather than economic theorists. Yet their practical solutions created economic frameworks that influenced European commercial development for centuries. Medieval royal environmental management represented early examples of systematic natural resource policy that influenced ecological development throughout royal territories. Royal forest laws, water rights regulations, and mining policies created environmental frameworks that balanced immediate economic needs with long-term resource sustainability. Medieval royal environmental decisions were made without modern ecological understanding, yet their practical resource management created environmental policies that affected regional development for generations. The cultural legacy of medieval kingship represents one of the most influential political traditions in European history. Medieval royal institutions created governmental frameworks, legal systems, diplomatic traditions, and cultural achievements that provided foundations for modern European civilization. Medieval kings governed effectively despite limited resources and primitive communication technologies, creating political stability and cultural development that influenced European development for centuries. The daily routine of medieval kingship concluded with evening reflections that combined personal prayer with political planning for future challenges. Medieval kings ended each day knowing that tomorrow would bring new threats to royal authority, fresh opportunities for political advancement, and additional challenges that would test their ability to maintain divine mandate through earthly power. Medieval royal authority was ultimately dependent on daily performance of political theatre, conducted under conditions of constant danger, with stakes that included personal survival and the fate of entire kingdoms. In conclusion, medieval kings didn't have days off. They had days when fewer people tried to kill them, which they considered vacation time. They managed to govern effectively through a combination of personal charisma, divine authority, military force, and sheer bloody-minded determination to maintain political power in a world where weakness was immediately fatal and strength was constantly tested. Medieval kingship was the ultimate extreme sport: governance with swords, diplomacy with the threat of warfare, and domestic policy conducted by people who considered trial by combat a reasonable dispute resolution mechanism. And somehow, despite the apparent chaos and violence, they managed to create a political and cultural foundation that would influence European development for centuries to come, all while dealing with related territorial disputes, managing marriage negotiations that resembled international treaty conferences, and trying not to get poisoned at dinner. The next time someone complains about work-life balance, remind them that medieval kings managed entire civilizations without coffee, weekends, or the reasonable expectation that their relatives wouldn't try to murder them for their job. They created legal systems while dodging assassins, built cathedrals while planning military campaigns, and established diplomatic relationships while managing family members who considered fratricide a legitimate path to career advancement. Medieval kingship was perhaps history's most demanding profession, requiring skills that combined military leadership, diplomatic finesse, administrative competence, cultural sophistication, and the psychological resilience necessary to maintain sanity while exercising absolute power under conditions of constant mortal peril. And they did it all while wearing crowns that weighed several pounds and clothing that required assistants to put on and take off. Because apparently medieval political authority came with a dress code that prioritized impressive appearance over practical comfort, much like everything else about being a medieval king,